By the time my mother was standing outside my office crying and begging me to save the family business, it was already too late. The cafe was gone. The bank accounts were frozen. My brother was desperately trying to avoid the consequences of choices he'd spent years making. And for the first time in my life, none of it was my responsibility. That sentence still feels strange to say, because for most of my life, responsibility was the role assigned to me. Not because I asked for it, not because I enjoyed it, but because everyone in my family decided that if something went wrong, I would be the one to fix it. I'm Mason, a 34-year-old financial consultant, and for nearly 15 years I played the role of family safety net. If a bill was overdue, I paid it. If an emergency happened, I handled it. If someone needed help, I was the first person they called. What nobody realized was that every time I solved a problem, I taught them that they never had to solve it themselves. My parents owned a small cafe in our hometown. When I was a kid, it was actually successful. Not wealthy successful, but stable. The kind of place where regular customers knew the staff by name and families gathered every weekend. My father took pride in it. My mother practically lived there. For years it supported our family comfortably. Then things started changing. Competition increased. Expenses grew. Customers became harder to keep. The cafe didn't fail overnight. It slowly bled money year after year. Around that same time, my younger brother Nathan became an adult. Nathan and I couldn't have been more different. I planned. Nathan improvised. I saved money. Nathan spent it. I accepted responsibility. Nathan avoided it whenever possible. Yet somehow he was always everyone's favorite. When Nathan got mediocre grades, my parents celebrated his effort. When I got excellent grades, they expected it. When Nathan quit jobs, they sympathized. When I worked late, they barely noticed. Growing up, I convinced myself that it didn't bother me. I told myself parents loved their children differently. I told myself comparisons were pointless. I told myself being the responsible one was a compliment. The truth was simpler. Nathan was the golden child, and I was useful. Those aren't the same thing. After college, I built a successful career in finance. Long hours, stressful clients, endless deadlines, but eventually it paid off. By my early 30s, I was making more money than anyone else in my family had ever earned. That's when the requests started. At first, they were reasonable. A medical bill here, a repair bill there, nothing outrageous. I genuinely wanted to help. They were my family. Why wouldn't I help? Then the requests became more frequent. The cafe needed new equipment. The cafe needed payroll assistance. The cafe needed inventory funding. The cafe needed temporary support. The word temporary became a permanent part of my life. 1 month turned into 6. 6 months turned into years. Before I realized it, I wasn't helping my parents occasionally. I was helping them constantly. Every month, money left my account and entered theirs. Sometimes a few $100s, sometimes several thousand. I never kept exact track. Partly because I didn't want to, partly because I knew the number would make me uncomfortable. Whenever I tried discussing long-term solutions, my parents resisted. Especially my mother. She always had a reason. Things would improve soon. Business would recover. They just needed a little more time, and every single time I believed her, because believing her was easier than accepting the truth. The truth was that my financial support had become part of their business model. Meanwhile, Nathan contributed almost nothing. He drifted from one idea to another. 1 month he wanted to start a clothing company. The next month it was cryptocurrency, then real estate, then online marketing, then something else. Every idea was supposedly going to make him rich. None of them lasted. Whenever his plans failed, my parents rushed to comfort him. Whenever I questioned his decisions, I was told to be supportive. Your brother is trying. I heard that phrase so often I could practically hear it in my sleep. Apparently trying mattered more than succeeding, at least in my family. Still, I kept helping, not because I was naive, but because somewhere deep down, I still believed loyalty worked both ways. I believed that if I continued showing up for my family, eventually they would show up for me. I believed sacrifice created appreciation. I believed effort created respect. I was wrong. About 6 months before everything collapsed, I paid for my parents' anniversary vacation. A luxury trip they never could have afforded themselves. My mother cried when I surprised her. My father hugged me. Nathan even thanked me. For a moment it felt like everything I'd done had finally been recognized. For a moment I felt valued. The feeling didn't last. Because the truth about a relationship always reveals itself when someone has to choose between appreciating you and taking you for granted. And a few weeks later, my family made that choice very clear. It started with what should have been an ordinary phone call, a simple invitation to a family dinner. At the time, I thought it was just another Saturday gathering. I had no idea that one phone call would end 15 years of loyalty and begin the most expensive lesson my family would ever learn. The betrayal didn't happen during a family argument. It didn't happen during some explosive confrontation. It didn't even happen face-to-face. It happened during a 2-minute phone call on a Friday evening while I was standing in my kitchen making coffee. And somehow, that made it worse. Because after everything I'd done for my family, they couldn't even look me in the eye when they decided I wasn't wanted. The day had started like dozens of others before it. At around 9 in the morning, my father called. His voice carried that familiar tension I'd learned to recognize over the years. A supplier payment was due. The cafe was short on cash. Again. I wasn't surprised. At that point, emergencies had become routine. When everything is always an emergency, nothing really feels urgent anymore. I listened while he explained the situation. A shipment needed to be paid for. The cafe couldn't delay. Without the inventory, they'd lose an entire weekend of business. I already knew how the conversation would end. It always ended the same way. I logged into my banking app, transferred the money, and solved another problem, just like I always did. My father thanked me. My mother sent a heart emoji. The crisis was over, at least until the next one. The amount wasn't small either. Several $1,000s disappeared from my account before lunch. Not enough to hurt me financially, but enough to remind me that I was carrying responsibilities that should never have belonged to me. Still, I didn't complain. I told myself it was family. I told myself they would do the same for me. Looking back now, that's probably the biggest lie I ever told myself. That evening, I was relaxing at home when my phone rang. Mom. I answered immediately. At first, everything seemed normal. She asked how work was going. She asked whether I'd been sleeping enough. She made small talk, which was unusual. My mother typically skipped straight to whatever she actually wanted. The small talk should have warned me. Instead, it just confused me. After a minute of awkward conversation, her voice changed. It became hesitant, careful, like someone trying to walk across thin ice. Mason, whenever someone starts a sentence that way, good news rarely follows. Yeah, there was something I wanted to discuss about tomorrow. I frowned. Tomorrow, the family dinner. I immediately assumed something had happened. Maybe somebody was sick. Maybe plans had changed. Maybe they needed to move the reservation. I wasn't prepared for what came next. Vanessa isn't comfortable around you. For several seconds, I genuinely thought I'd misheard her. Excuse me, my mother sighed. Nathan's girlfriend. I know who Vanessa is. She feels uncomfortable around you. I stared at the wall, trying to make sense of the words, trying to figure out what possible interaction she could be referring to. I'd only met Vanessa a handful of times. Our conversations had been polite, brief, forgettable. Nothing remotely dramatic had ever happened. What exactly does that mean? My mother's hesitation grew worse. She says you're intimidating. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because it was absurd. Intimidating? She feels judged. By what? By the way you look at her. I blinked. What, Mason, don't make this difficult. That sentence instantly shifted something inside me, because suddenly this wasn't about understanding. It wasn't about resolving a misunderstanding. The decision had already been made. They were simply informing me. I felt a knot forming in my stomach. So what are you saying? Silence. Then finally, we think it would be best if you skipped dinner tomorrow. The room became very quiet. I remember hearing my refrigerator humming in the background. I remember hearing traffic outside. I remember every tiny detail except my mother's voice because my brain was struggling to process what she just said. Skip dinner. Their son. The same son who had transferred thousands of dollars to them less than 10 hours earlier. The same son who had spent years helping them survive. The same son paying their bills, was being uninvited from family dinner because his brother's girlfriend didn't like him. I honestly thought she was joking. You're serious? Please understand. No, Mom. My voice remained calm, almost too calm. I don't understand. She sighed again. The kind of sigh people use when they believe they're dealing with someone unreasonable. Vanessa is important to Nathan. So, we want her to feel welcome. The words hit harder than I expected, because hidden inside that sentence was another message. A message neither of us said out loud. We want her to feel welcome. More welcome than you. I sat down slowly, trying to keep my emotions under control. Are you seriously choosing Nathan's girlfriend over your own son? That's not what we're doing. It sounds exactly like what you're doing. You're being dramatic. There it was. The phrase every family scapegoat eventually hears. Whenever your feelings become inconvenient, you're dramatic. Whenever you're hurt, you're sensitive. Whenever you object, you're selfish. The problem is never what they did. The problem is your reaction to it. I suddenly felt exhausted. Not angry, not yet, just tired. Tired of being the responsible one, tired of being understanding, tired of always making accommodations for everyone else. I looked at the banking notification still sitting in my email inbox. The transfer I'd made that morning, thousands of dollars, gone. And suddenly a thought entered my mind that refused to leave. If my money was welcome, why wasn't I? I asked one final question. Did Dad agree with this? Yes. Nathan? Yes. The answer hurt more than I expected, because that meant nobody had defended me. Nobody had said this was wrong. Nobody had stood up and said maybe excluding the person paying everyone's bills wasn't a great idea. Not one person. The decision had probably taken 5 minutes. The consequences would last years. I took a slow breath, then another. Then I said something that seemed harmless at the time, something none of them paid attention to, something that would completely change all of our lives. Okay, my mother sounded relieved. Thank you for understanding. I almost laughed. Because understanding was the last thing happening. I hung up, sat alone in silence. And for the first time in 15 years, I began wondering what would happen if I stopped being the family's safety net. By Monday morning, I would have my answer, and my family would discover exactly how expensive it was to take someone for granted. People like to imagine life-changing decisions as dramatic moments. A slammed door, a screaming match, a declaration of independence. The truth is usually much quieter. My decision happened on a Monday morning while sitting at my office desk with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold. I wasn't emotional anymore. That surprised me. I expected to wake up angry after being uninvited from dinner. Instead, I felt calm. Calmer than I had felt in years. Because once the shock wore off, something became impossible to ignore. The problem wasn't the dinner. The problem wasn't Vanessa. The problem wasn't even Nathan. The problem was that my family had spent years treating my support as an entitlement instead of a gift. The dinner invitation had simply exposed it. For the first time, I wasn't looking at individual incidents. I was looking at the pattern, and the pattern was ugly. Every sacrifice I made had become an expectation. Every favor had become an obligation. Every act of generosity had become invisible. I opened my laptop. Then I started reviewing everything. Automatic transfers, business guarantees, vendor payments, monthly assistance, emergency funds, vacation expenses, insurance contributions. The list kept growing. By the time I finished reviewing everything, I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen. The total made me feel sick, not because of the money, because of what it represented. Years of effort, years of loyalty, years of believing I was helping my family. And somehow, despite all of it, I wasn't important enough to sit at their dinner table. That realization made my next decision surprisingly easy. I started making phone calls. The first one was to my bank. I canceled every automatic transfer connected to my parents. The second call was to a supplier whose invoices I'd personally guaranteed. I informed them I would no longer be acting as financial backup. The third call canceled the luxury anniversary trip I'd purchased for my parents. The trip wasn't scheduled for another few months, so I recovered most of the money. Then I continued. One account after another, one commitment after another, not out of revenge, not out of spite, because I finally understood something. Support only works when it's voluntary. The moment someone feels entitled to it, it stops being support and starts becoming exploitation. By noon, 15 years of financial dependency had ended. I expected to feel guilty. Instead, I felt lighter. For the first time in years, my family's future wasn't sitting on my shoulders. The peace lasted approximately 3 hours. At 3:17 p.m., my phone rang. Dad, I let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, he called again. Then Mom, then Nathan, then Mom again, then Dad again. The pattern continued until my phone looked like it was having a nervous breakdown. I already knew what had happened. Somebody had noticed the money wasn't coming. I waited until evening before listening to the messages. Dad's was first. Mason, call me immediately. No greeting, no concern, just urgency. The second message was worse. The supplier called. What's going on? The third message came from Mom. Her voice sounded panicked. Honey, there must be some mistake. A mistake, of course, because in their minds, the idea that I might intentionally stop helping them wasn't even possible. I listened to Nathan's message last. His tone immediately annoyed me. What the hell are you doing? Not, are you okay? Not, can we talk? Just anger. As though I had violated some agreement, as though my money belonged to him. I ignored every message. The next morning, they escalated. By lunch, my phone had received over 30 calls. Around 4 o'clock, I finally answered. Mom picked up before the first ring finished. Mason, her relief lasted about 2 seconds, then panic returned. What happened to the payments? I leaned back in my chair. Nothing about this conversation surprised me. Nobody had called to discuss the dinner. Nobody had apologized. Nobody had asked how I felt. The moment money disappeared, suddenly I mattered again. The payments stopped. I know they stopped. Her voice rose. Why? I waited, just long enough to make the silence uncomfortable. Then I said, I assumed I wasn't part of the family anymore. Silence, not confusion, not surprise, silence, because she knew exactly what I meant. Mason, don't do this. There it was again, the same phrase, the same dismissal, the same refusal to acknowledge reality. I laughed softly. Interesting. What? When I was paying everyone's bills, nobody thought I was being dramatic. Mason, no, Mom. For the first time in years, I interrupted her. You uninvited me from family dinner because Nathan's girlfriend didn't like me. That's not. It is exactly what happened. She started explaining, trying to soften it, trying to reframe it, trying to make it sound reasonable. But once someone finally sees the truth, excuses lose their power. I wasn't listening anymore, not really. Because another realization had arrived. The conversation wasn't about fixing our relationship. It was about fixing their finances. Dad grabbed the phone next. His frustration was obvious. "You're hurting the business." I almost laughed, because that statement perfectly summarized our entire family dynamic. Not "you're hurting us." Not "you're hurting the family." Not "we're sorry." The business, the money, the resources, that's what mattered. I answered calmly. "No, Dad." "What?" "I'm not hurting the business." "Then what would you call this?" "I'm simply no longer funding it." The silence that followed felt enormous. Because deep down he knew I was right. A business that survives only because someone else keeps rescuing it isn't surviving. It's being kept alive artificially. Then Nathan joined the call, and everything exploded. "You can't do this." The entitlement in his voice was almost unbelievable. I actually smiled. "Watch me. You owe this family." That sentence changed everything, not because it hurt, because it revealed exactly how they saw me. Not as a son, not as a brother, not as a person, as an obligation, an endless source of money, a financial utility, something to be used. I suddenly felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just clarity. 15 years of confusion vanished in seconds. "You know what, Nathan?" "What?" "If my money is welcome but I'm not, then neither of us will be showing up anymore." Then I ended the call, blocked every number, and sat quietly in my office. For the first time in 15 years, nobody could reach me. The silence felt incredible, but across town, panic was already spreading, because my family was about to discover something terrifying. They had built their entire lives around the assumption that I would always save them. And now they were about to find out what happened when I didn't. People often think cutting toxic people out of your life immediately solves everything. It doesn't. Sometimes the hardest part begins after you leave, because people who benefited from your sacrifices rarely accept losing them quietly. And my family definitely didn't. The first month after I blocked everyone was surprisingly peaceful. No emergency calls, no last-minute requests, no guilt trips, no financial crises becoming my responsibility. For the first time in years, I had entire weekends that actually belonged to me. I started sleeping better. My stress levels dropped. Even my coworkers noticed the difference. One afternoon, a colleague I'd worked with for years looked at me and said, "You seem happier lately." I hadn't realized it until that moment, but he was right. I was happier, not because my life had suddenly become perfect, because the constant pressure had disappeared. For years, I'd been carrying responsibilities that weren't mine. Now I wasn't. Simple as that. Unfortunately, while I was enjoying peace, my family was creating a very different story. I discovered that about 6 weeks later. A cousin called unexpectedly. We weren't particularly close. Close enough to exchange holiday messages, not close enough for random phone calls, which immediately made me suspicious. After a few minutes of awkward small talk, he finally got to the point. "Mason, can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Is everything okay with your parents?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" There was hesitation. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. "They've been telling everyone you abandoned them." I laughed, not because it was funny, because it was so predictable. Of course they were. When accountability feels uncomfortable, blame becomes easier. "What exactly are they saying?" My cousin sounded uncomfortable. "They said you became arrogant after making money." I closed my eyes, of course. "They said you cut them off without warning." Interesting. "They said you don't care about family anymore." That one almost made me laugh. The irony was incredible. For years, I'd practically financed their lives, yet somehow I was the selfish one. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes. By the end, I had a much clearer picture. My parents weren't simply explaining my absence. They were actively rewriting history, according to their version of events. I had suddenly become greedy. I refused to help. I abandoned struggling parents. I destroyed the family business. Nathan had apparently become the victim in all of this, which honestly wasn't surprising. In every family story, the golden child somehow ends up innocent, even when they're holding the match that started the fire. Over the following months, similar conversations kept happening. Friends, relatives, former family acquaintances, people I'd barely spoken to in years. Everyone had heard some version of the story. Most were polite enough to ask my side. Some weren't. A few simply assumed the accusations were true. At first it bothered me, then it stopped. Because eventually I realized something important. People who genuinely cared about me asked questions. People who immediately believed the worst weren't really on my side to begin with. That realization simplified a lot of relationships. Around the same time, another problem started emerging. The cafe wasn't improving. In fact, it was getting worse. Much worse. Word traveled quickly in our town. Suppliers were complaining. Employees were leaving. Customers noticed changes. Several people mentioned that the business seemed to be struggling far more than expected. That part confused me. Because while I'd removed financial support, the cafe should still have been functioning. It wasn't healthy, but it shouldn't have been collapsing that quickly. Something didn't make sense. The numbers didn't add up. And as someone who worked in finance, few things bothered me more than numbers that didn't make sense. The thought stayed in the back of my mind for weeks. Then one day I received an email, a completely routine email, one that almost ended up deleted. Before cutting ties, I'd helped organize some accounting software for the cafe. Apparently my contact information hadn't been removed from one of the systems. A notification appeared in my inbox. Normally I would have ignored it. Instead, curiosity got the better of me. I opened it. At first, nothing seemed unusual, just transaction records, vendor payments, inventory purchases, routine business activity. Then something caught my eye, a company name, one I didn't recognize. That wasn't unusual by itself. Businesses use new vendors all the time, but the payment amount seemed strange. Large, recurring, frequent. I checked another transaction. Then another, then another. The same company kept appearing. Again and again, my instincts immediately activated. Years in finance had taught me to trust patterns, and this pattern felt wrong, very wrong. I started digging, not obsessively, not yet. Just enough to satisfy my curiosity. The more I looked, the stranger things became. Payments were being made regularly, thousands of dollars at a time, yet there was very little documentation attached. No detailed invoices, no clear descriptions, no obvious justification, just money leaving the business, over and over. A cold feeling settled into my stomach because I recognized the signs. I'd seen similar situations before, fraud investigations, embezzlement cases, financial misconduct. The details varied. The warning signs rarely did. I spent the next few days researching quietly, carefully, methodically. The company itself wasn't easy to track, which immediately raised another red flag. Legitimate businesses usually leave footprints. This one barely existed. Minimal public information, almost no business presence, very little activity. It felt less like a company and more like a disguise. The deeper I looked, the worse my feeling became. Then I found something that stopped me cold. An address, a registration document, a name connected to the company. At first I thought I was reading it incorrectly. I checked again, then a third time. The name didn't change. My pulse started rising, because the person connected to the company wasn't a supplier, wasn't a vendor, wasn't an outside contractor. It was someone I knew, someone very well. Someone who had spent years claiming the cafe's financial struggles weren't his fault. Someone my parents defended constantly. Someone who had somehow always seemed to have money despite never holding a stable job. Nathan, I stared at the screen for several minutes, not moving, not speaking, just thinking. Because if what I was seeing was true, then everything changed. Every bailout, every emergency, every request for help, every financial crisis. All of it, the cafe might not have been struggling because of bad luck. It might have been bleeding money from the inside. And if Nathan was involved, then my family had a much bigger problem than losing my support. They had a thief sitting at their dinner table, the same dinner table they decided I wasn't welcome to attend. And for the first time since walking away, I seriously considered getting involved again. Not to save them, not anymore, but because I needed to know the truth. And something told me the truth was going to be far uglier than anyone expected. I wish I could say I was shocked. I wish I could say discovering Nathan's name attached to that company felt impossible. But the truth is, once I saw it, too many pieces suddenly fit together. The surprise wasn't that Nathan was involved. The surprise was how long he'd managed to get away with it. For the next week, I treated the situation exactly like I would any financial investigation at work. Slowly, carefully, without assumptions, because assumptions are dangerous, facts aren't. Every evening after work, I'd sit at my desk and start digging. The company connected to Nathan looked legitimate on paper. It had registration documents, tax filings, business records, everything necessary to appear real. But something felt off. The more I examined it, the more obvious the cracks became. The company didn't seem to actually do anything. No employees, no meaningful customer activity, no online presence, no advertising, no portfolio, no visible services, yet somehow thousands of dollars were flowing into it every month from my parents' cafe. That wasn't normal, not even close. I started comparing transaction records, then payment dates, then invoice numbers. Patterns emerged almost immediately. Many of the invoices appeared suspiciously similar. Same formatting, same wording, same vague descriptions. Instead of listing actual services, they used generic terms. Consulting, operational support, marketing assistance. The kind of language people use when they don't want anyone asking questions. My stomach sank further with every document because I knew exactly what I was looking at. Someone wasn't just taking money, someone was hiding it. The deeper I dug, the bigger the numbers became. $5,000 here, $3,000 there, $8,000 somewhere else, small enough individually to avoid attention, large enough collectively to cause serious damage. The payments stretched back years, not months, years. And suddenly memories started replaying in my head. Every emergency call, every crisis, every desperate request for financial help, Every conversation where my parents claimed they couldn't understand why the business was struggling. Maybe they genuinely didn't understand, or maybe they never wanted to. A few days later, I found something even worse. Credit card statements. The company receiving the money wasn't using it for business expenses. It was funding Nathan's lifestyle. Luxury hotels, designer clothing, weekend trips, expensive restaurants, electronics, entertainment. Thousands and thousands of dollars spent on things that had absolutely nothing to do with running a cafe. I sat back in my chair and rubbed my face. Part of me wanted to stop looking, because every new piece of evidence made me angrier, not just at Nathan, at myself. For years, I'd worked extra hours, skipped vacations, delayed purchases, sacrificed my own comfort because I thought I was helping my family survive. Meanwhile, Nathan had apparently been using the business like his personal ATM. The realization felt like a punch to the chest. I wasn't funding my parents. I had been indirectly funding him, the golden child. Again. By the end of the second week, I had enough information to estimate the damage. The total nearly made me fall out of my chair. Over $180,000. I checked the calculations 3 separate times, then a fourth. The number stayed the same. More than $180,000. Gone. Drained from the business over several years. No wonder the cafe constantly needed rescuing. No wonder payroll was always short. No wonder suppliers weren't being paid. No wonder my parents kept asking for help. The cafe hadn't just been struggling. It had been bleeding to death, and Nathan had been holding the knife. I spent several days deciding what to do next. Part of me wanted to walk away completely. After all, they had chosen Nathan over me repeatedly. Maybe they deserved to deal with the consequences. Maybe it wasn't my problem anymore. But another part of me couldn't ignore what I'd found. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted certainty. I needed confirmation before making any decisions. So I contacted someone I trusted, a former colleague who specialized in forensic accounting. I didn't tell him everything, just enough to get a professional opinion. After reviewing the documents, his response was immediate. "This doesn't look good." That wasn't exactly comforting. "How bad?" He stared at the records for several moments, then sighed. "If these documents are authentic, someone is almost certainly funneling money." Almost certainly, not maybe, not possibly, almost certainly. Hearing it from another professional made everything real. This wasn't suspicion anymore. This wasn't family drama. This was fraud, potentially criminal fraud, and suddenly I understood something terrifying. My parents weren't the only victims. Employees were victims, suppliers were victims, customers were victims. Anyone connected to that business was suffering because of decisions Nathan had made. The next morning I made a choice, not an emotional choice, a practical one. I organized every document, every transaction, every invoice, every financial record. I created timelines, summaries, evidence folders, the same way I would prepare any professional case. Then I handed everything to an attorney. I didn't contact my parents. I didn't contact Nathan. I didn't issue threats. I didn't make dramatic speeches. I simply provided the evidence and let professionals handle it. Because once fraud enters the conversation, family relationships stop mattering. Facts become the only thing that counts. A week later, everything exploded, and I mean everything. Apparently, attorneys have a way of creating urgency that family members don't. Questions started being asked. Records started being reviewed. Banks started paying attention. Suppliers started demanding explanations. And for the first time in his life, Nathan couldn't charm his way out of the situation. The lies that had protected him for years were finally running into documentation. And documentation always wins. My phone remained blocked. I wasn't speaking to anyone, but information still found its way to me. Friends talked. Former employees talked. Relatives talked. The entire town seemed to be buzzing with rumors. The cafe wasn't just struggling anymore. People were openly questioning whether it would survive. Nathan was suddenly disappearing whenever difficult conversations happened. Vanessa was nowhere to be seen. My parents were reportedly panicking, and for the first time, nobody could blame me. Because this disaster had started long before I stopped helping, I had simply uncovered it. One evening, after hearing another update from a mutual acquaintance, I sat alone in my apartment and thought about the family dinner. The dinner I hadn't been invited to. The dinner where they chose Nathan's girlfriend over their son. The irony was almost unbelievable. If they'd never pushed me away, I probably never would have looked closely enough to uncover any of this. They created the exact circumstances that exposed the truth. And now the truth was coming for all of them. What none of us realized yet was just how devastating the fallout would become. Because the cafe wasn't merely heading toward trouble. It was heading toward collapse. And once the collapse started, there would be no stopping it. There is a moment in every disaster when people stop pretending everything is under control. A moment when excuses stop working. A moment when reality becomes too obvious to ignore. For my family, that moment arrived about 3 months after the investigation began. Up until then, they had been doing what they'd always done. Denying, deflecting, blaming, hoping the problem would somehow disappear on its own. But problems built on stolen money don't disappear. They grow, and eventually they collect interest. The first major crack appeared when several suppliers stopped extending credit to the cafe. For years, suppliers had tolerated late payments because they trusted my parents. The cafe had been around for decades. It had a reputation. People wanted to believe things would improve. Unfortunately, trust only lasts so long. Once questions about missing money started circulating, patience disappeared. Suddenly, suppliers wanted payment up front. No exceptions. No delays, no promises, cash only. The cafe wasn't prepared for that. Their entire operation depended on flexibility. Without it, daily business became difficult almost overnight. Then the employees started leaving. At first, it was one person, then another, then several more. Nobody likes working for a sinking ship, especially when paychecks become uncertain. A longtime manager quit after nearly 10 years. A week later, 2 senior staff members followed. Customers noticed. Service slowed. Mistakes increased. Regulars started going elsewhere. The cafe's reputation began unraveling, and once reputation starts collapsing, recovery becomes almost impossible. Meanwhile, Nathan was apparently having the worst months of his life. Not that I felt much sympathy. According to several mutual acquaintances, he spent most of his time trying to convince everyone he was being unfairly targeted. Nothing was ever his fault. The invoices weren't what they seemed. The transactions had explanations. The investigation was exaggerated. The evidence was misunderstood. The stories changed constantly. That's the problem with lies. You have to keep creating new ones to support the old ones. Eventually, the entire structure collapses under its own weight. Vanessa disappeared around this time, which surprised absolutely nobody. Apparently, being the girlfriend of a charming entrepreneur was exciting. Being the girlfriend of a man facing serious fraud allegations was considerably less attractive. One day she was posting pictures with him online. The next day she was gone. No dramatic farewell, no public defense, just gone. I remember hearing that and laughing harder than I probably should have, because Nathan had spent years choosing temporary people over permanent relationships. And now one of those temporary people had vanished the moment things became inconvenient. Poetic, honestly, but the real damage wasn't happening to Nathan. It was happening to my parents. That was the part that hurt, despite everything. Despite the favoritism, despite the betrayal, they were still my parents. And hearing about what was happening to them wasn't easy. My father, according to multiple relatives, looked 10 years older. The stress was crushing him. Years of financial pressure had already worn him down. Now he was being forced to confront a possibility he'd spent years refusing to consider. That his favorite son might have been responsible for much of the family's suffering. I can't imagine how painful that realization must have been. My mother handled it differently. She doubled down, at least initially. For months, she continued defending Nathan. Continued insisting there had to be some misunderstanding. Continued searching for explanations that didn't require accepting reality. Parents are remarkable that way. Sometimes love blinds them so completely that they can't see what's standing directly in front of them. Unfortunately, reality doesn't care about denial. The evidence kept growing. Bank records, financial statements, vendor documentation, payment histories, everything pointed in the same direction. Eventually, even my mother couldn't ignore it anymore. And when that happened, something inside her apparently broke. Relatives later told me she started crying constantly. She barely slept, barely ate, spent most of her time trying to understand how things had reached this point. The answer was simple, but painful. Because the truth wasn't that Nathan had suddenly become dishonest. The truth was that everyone had spent years refusing to hold him accountable. Every excuse, every second chance, every consequence avoided, every problem somebody else solved. All of it led here. Then came the loans. That was the final blow. Many people didn't realize how much debt the cafe was carrying. I certainly hadn't. Once lenders began reviewing the situation, things deteriorated rapidly. Credit lines were restricted. Renewals were denied. Financial support vanished. The safety nets disappeared one by one. Without cash flow, the business couldn't survive. And unlike previous years, there was no Mason available to rescue everyone. I heard later that my father actually mentioned my name during one meeting. Not angrily, not bitterly, just sadly. According to someone who was there, he looked around the room and quietly said, "If we'd listened to Mason years ago, maybe none of this would have happened." When I heard that, I didn't know how to feel. Part of me appreciated it. Part of me hated that it came so late, because recognition after disaster isn't the same as respect before it. A few weeks later, the announcement became official. The cafe was closing. After more than 30 years. Done, finished, gone. I wasn't there when it happened. I didn't attend the final day. I didn't drive by. I didn't watch. Some people probably expected me to celebrate, expected me to feel vindicated. expected me to enjoy being proven right. I didn't. There was no joy in it, only sadness. Because that cafe had been part of my childhood, some of my happiest memories existed inside those walls. Watching it disappear felt like attending a funeral for something that should have lived longer. The difference was that this death wasn't caused by bad luck. It was caused by choices, years and years of choices, and now everyone was paying the bill. Then just when I thought the story was finally over, my phone rang for the first time in nearly a year. A number I hadn't blocked, a number I barely recognized. When I answered, a familiar voice spoke. My aunt. And what she told me next changed everything. Because apparently my mother had spent weeks trying to find me. Not to argue, not to blame me, not even to defend Nathan. She wanted to apologize, and more importantly, she wanted to ask for help. Again. The first thing I noticed was the handwriting. Even before I opened the envelope, I recognized it instantly. My mother's. Some things stay familiar no matter how much time passes. I'd spent almost a year avoiding contact with my family. No calls, no visits, no holiday gatherings, no awkward conversations. The silence had become normal, comfortable even. Which was why seeing that envelope sitting in my mailbox felt so strange. For several minutes I simply stared at it. Part of me wanted to throw it away. Part of me wanted to burn it. Part of me wanted to open it immediately. In the end, curiosity won. I carried it inside, sat at my kitchen table, and slowly unfolded the pages. There were 6 of them. 6 handwritten pages. That alone told me this wasn't a typical message. My mother hated writing long letters. The fact that she'd filled 6 pages meant something important was inside. I started reading. And within the first paragraph, I realized this wasn't the letter I expected. There were no excuses, no accusations, no attempts to blame me, no complaints about money. Instead, the very first sentence said something I never thought I'd hear. I owe you an apology that should have happened years ago. I read that line 3 times, not because it was complicated, because it was shocking. My mother had spent most of her life avoiding accountability. Seeing those words felt almost unreal. The letter continued. She admitted things I'd spent years trying to explain. She admitted Nathan had been treated differently. She admitted they expected more from me than they expected from him. She admitted they'd relied on me too heavily. She admitted they'd taken my help for granted. Every paragraph felt like stepping into an alternate reality. The mother writing this letter sounded completely different from the woman I'd known for most of my life. Then I reached the section that hit hardest. You were always the child we worried about the least. I stopped reading. Not because the sentence was cruel, because it explained everything, every ignored achievement, every overlooked sacrifice. Every time Nathan received attention while I received expectations, they hadn't loved me less. At least not intentionally. They simply assumed I would be okay. Nathan failed, so they rushed to help him. I succeeded, so they assumed I didn't need help. The result was the same either way. One child received support. The other received responsibility. I continued reading. The letter described the collapse of the cafe, the investigations, the debt, the shame, the community gossip, the realization that much of the business's suffering had been caused by Nathan. According to my mother, discovering the truth had shattered her, not just financially, emotionally. She wrote about sleepless nights, panic attacks, constant guilt, the pain of realizing she'd spent years defending the wrong person. At one point, she wrote, "Every warning you gave us turned out to be correct." That sentence hurt more than any insult ever could, because I never wanted to be right. I would have happily been wrong. I would have loved for Nathan to become successful. I would have loved for the cafe to thrive. I would have loved for my family to prove my concerns were unnecessary. Instead, reality had validated every fear I'd ever expressed, and nobody benefited from that. By the time I reached page 5, tears were sitting in the corners of my eyes. Not because I was overwhelmed, because grief is complicated. I wasn't grieving the loss of my family. I was grieving the family I wished I'd had. The family I'd spent years believing existed. The family that only seemed to appear after everything was already broken. Then I reached the final page, and suddenly the tone changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough that I immediately noticed. My mother explained that she and my father were struggling. The cafe was gone, savings were limited, medical expenses were increasing, retirement plans had essentially vanished, the future looked uncertain. I kept reading, then I found the sentence that changed everything. "I know I don't deserve to ask this, but we need your help." I closed my eyes, there it was, the thing I'd been expecting from the beginning, help, not conversation. Not reconciliation, not understanding, help. Money wasn't mentioned directly, neither was a specific amount, but it didn't need to be. The meaning was obvious. The apology was real. I genuinely believe that. My mother meant every word she wrote. The problem was that she still hadn't fully escaped the mindset that created all of this. Even after everything. Even after losing the cafe. Even after discovering Nathan's betrayal. Part of her still looked at me and saw a solution. A safety net. A rescuer, the person responsible for fixing disasters. I folded the letter carefully. then sat in silence for a long time. Hours, actually, because the decision wasn't easy. People love simple stories. They love revenge. They love dramatic endings where the hero slams the door and walks away forever. Real life rarely works that way. These were still my parents. Despite everything, I didn't hate them. I wasn't angry anymore. The anger had burned itself out months ago. What remained was something quieter: acceptance, understanding, distance. The next morning I started writing a response, not because I wanted to send money, not because I wanted to restart our old relationship, because my mother deserved an answer. The woman who wrote that letter had finally told the truth, for the first time in years. That deserved acknowledgement, so I wrote, page after page, carefully choosing every word, explaining things I'd never been able to say before, explaining what it felt like to spend years being valued primarily for what I could provide, explaining what happened the night they chose Nathan's girlfriend over me, explaining why I left, explaining why I stayed away, and most importantly, explaining why I couldn't come back the way they wanted. A week later, my mother called. For the first time in nearly a year, I answered, and before the conversation ended, we agreed to meet. One final time, not to rebuild the past, not to save the future, just to say the things that should have been said years ago. Neither of us realized it then, but that meeting would become the real ending of our story. The cafe had been closed for almost 8 months when I finally saw my mother again. We met at a small coffee shop halfway between our homes. Not the cafe. That building was empty now. Dark windows, locked doors. A permanent reminder of everything that had happened. I arrived early, partly out of habit, partly because I wasn't sure how I'd feel once she walked through the door. For nearly a year, my family had existed mostly as memories and second-hand updates. Now I was about to sit across from one of the people who had shaped most of my life. The woman who had raised me, the woman who had hurt me, the woman who had finally apologized. When she entered the cafe, I almost didn't recognize her. Not because she'd changed completely, because she looked tired, older, smaller somehow. The confident energy she used to carry was gone. Life had humbled her. And unfortunately, life tends to charge expensive tuition for those lessons. She spotted me and smiled weakly. I stood. We hugged awkwardly. Neither of us knew exactly how to do this anymore. Then we sat down. For a few minutes, neither of us said much. We talked about the weather, traffic, work, all the meaningless topics people use when they're avoiding the real conversation. Eventually, my mother sighed, then looked directly at me. I don't know where to start, I nodded. Neither do I, she laughed softly. For a moment, she looked like the mother I remembered from childhood, then her eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry. Just 2 words, simple, quiet. But somehow heavier than anything else she'd said. I believed her. That was the strange part. A year earlier, I probably would have assumed she was trying to manipulate me. Now I could see the difference. This wasn't manipulation. This was regret. Real regret, the kind people feel when they finally understand the consequences of their choices. I'm sorry for Nathan. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I'm sorry for the cafe. Another pause, then. I'm sorry for how we treated you. The words settled between us. I took a slow breath. For years I'd imagined hearing those sentences. I'd imagined how satisfying it would feel, how healing, how validating. The reality was more complicated. Because apologies don't erase history, they acknowledge it. That's important. But they're not the same thing. My mother continued talking. She admitted things she'd never admitted before. How often she dismissed my concerns. How frequently she'd expected me to sacrifice. How easily she'd forgiven Nathan. How difficult she'd made it for me to express frustration. Every confession felt honest, painfully honest. At one point she looked down at her hands and whispered, I thought being hard on you would make you stronger. I stared at her for several seconds, then nodded. It did. Her eyes lifted. But it also taught me something else. What? I leaned back in my chair, carefully choosing my words. It taught me that love in our family was often tied to usefulness. The sentence hit her hard, I could see it. Because she knew there was truth in it, not intentional truth, but truth nonetheless. Nathan received love because he needed help. I received approval because I provided help. Neither relationship was healthy, just dysfunctional in different ways. For nearly 2 hours we talked, really talked, perhaps for the first time in our lives. No excuses, no arguments, no pretending, just honesty. And honestly, it felt good. Not because it fixed everything, because it finally felt real. Eventually, the conversation reached the subject we'd both been avoiding, the future. My mother hesitated, then asked the question she'd probably been carrying since the moment she wrote the letter. Is there any chance we can be a family again? The old version of me would have immediately said yes, without hesitation, without conditions, without boundaries. The old version of me would have sacrificed his own peace to make everyone else comfortable. But that version of me no longer existed. I looked at my mother carefully, then answered truthfully. We can have a relationship. Hope appeared in her eyes, then I continued. But it won't be the relationship we used to have. The hope faded slightly, not because she disagreed, because she understood. I wasn't coming back as the family rescuer, the family banker, the emergency solution. That chapter was over, forever. A long silence followed. Then I finally said the thing I'd carried inside me for years, the thing that explained everything, the thing that marked the true ending of our story. I spent 20 years trying to become important enough for this family. My mother's face crumpled. Tears immediately returned. I continued anyway. The day you chose Nathan's girlfriend over me. My voice remained calm. It was the day I finally understood I never would be. The words hung in the air. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us needed to, because we both knew they were true. That dinner had never really been about Vanessa. It had been about value, priority, respect. It had exposed a reality I'd spent years refusing to acknowledge, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. My mother cried quietly. Not dramatically, just heartbreakingly, because there was nothing left to argue against. No defense, no explanation, only consequences. Eventually, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm sorry," I nodded. "I know," and for the first time in my life, that was enough. Not because everything was forgiven, because forgiveness and trust are different things. Forgiveness had happened, trust would probably never fully return, and that was okay. Some relationships survive, some relationships change. Ours would have to change. When we finally stood to leave, my mother asked one final question. "Do you think you'll ever help us again?" The old question. The question that had defined most of my adult life. I smiled sadly, then gave her the only honest answer. "If I ever help you again, it'll be because I choose to. Not because I owe you, not because I'm responsible. Not because I'm afraid of disappointing everyone, because I choose to." The difference mattered, more than she probably realized. We hugged goodbye, then walked in opposite directions, and that was it. No dramatic reconciliation. No miracle ending. No emotional movie scene where everyone suddenly becomes a perfect family. Just two people finally telling the truth. As I drove home, I realized something surprising. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I wasn't relieved. I was free. The cafe was gone. My brother had lost nearly everything. My parents were living with the consequences of years of denial. And for the first time, none of those burdens belonged to me. For years, I thought freedom meant escaping responsibility. I was wrong. Freedom meant understanding which responsibilities were never yours to carry in the first place. My brother lost the money he stole. My parents lost the business they spent decades building. But the biggest loss wasn't financial. They lost the version of me that would have sacrificed everything to keep saving them. And the biggest thing I gained wasn't money. It wasn't peace. It wasn't vindication. It was something far more valuable, the ability to finally choose myself.